There's a fisherman standing on a boat in the middle of a dark, churning sea. His name is Spyros, and he's not a warrior, he's not a king. He's not chosen by the gods or destined for anything in particular. He's just a man, hauling nets, reading the tide, living a quiet life on the edge of an ancient world where gods are real and mortals are, by design, beneath them. And then his net catches something it was never meant to catch, a coffin, drifting, sealed. He opens it. Inside, against every law of nature and gods, there's a woman and a baby. The woman is dead. The baby is alive, crying, gripping the air with his tiny fists like he's already fighting something. And the fisherman, this completely ordinary man who has no business being in this story, does the only thing a genuinely decent human being could do. He takes the child home. That image, a survivor pulled from black water, a baby belonging to no world in particular, held by a man who has nothing to offer but his decency, is the real beginning of Clash of the Titans. Not on Mount Olympus, not in some blazing throne room of marble and lightning, in the sea, with a fisherman and an infant. It's a quietly devastating opening for a movie that, based on its trailers and reputation, you might expect to begin with an explosion and someone shouting dramatically. It doesn't. And that choice, that decision to ground an epic in a single human moment before the monsters arrive, tells you everything about what this movie is trying to be. Whether it always succeeds at being that thing is a different conversation, but the intention is there, and it's worth taking seriously. The year was 2010, and Hollywood was having a full-blown identity crisis, in the most commercially interesting way possible. James Cameron's Avatar had just shattered the global box office the previous December, earning nearly $2.8 billion worldwide and completely rewriting what studios thought audiences expected from a theatrical event. The lesson Hollywood drew from that wasn't particularly nuanced. People want scale, people want immersion, people want 3D. And so studios scrambled to retrofit their upcoming slates, converting films shot in standard 2D into three-dimensional experiences in post-production, stacking a premium ticket surcharge on top, and betting that audiences either wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. This bet did not always pay off. But beyond the 3D arms race, and we will absolutely get into that because the story of Clash of the Titans and 3D is one of the most instructive disaster stories in modern Hollywood history. Mythology was genuinely having a moment in 2010. Percy Jackson and the Olympians landed in theaters the same February. God of War had already spent several years giving an entire generation a visceral, deeply personal relationship with Greek gods as power-mad tyrants you could actually kill. HBO's Rome had reintroduced ancient worlds to mainstream prestige audiences. There was a real hunger out there for stories where the gods weren't abstract theology. They were walking, scheming, terrifyingly powerful figures you might actually run into on the road to Athens and who might decide, on a whim, to ruin your life. Clash of the Titans arrived to feed that hunger, and commercially, it absolutely did. $493 million worldwide. One of the highest-grossing films of the year. A genuine blockbuster by any measure that held the #1 position for 2 straight weeks. But it also landed in the middle of controversy that would follow it for years. A controversy that, ironically, had almost nothing to do with the movie itself and everything to do with what the studio did to it in the final weeks before release. But we'll get there. First, let's understand what this movie actually was. Clash of the Titans is directed by Louis Leterrier, a French filmmaker with a very specific and very valuable skill set. He understands how bodies move through space. His transporter films are propulsive in a way that feels almost choreographic. You feel the physics, the weight, the consequence of every impact. The Incredible Hulk in 2008 proved he could work at genuine scale, staging battles between enormous CG figures without completely losing the human thread underneath. Leterrier gets kinetic momentum. He knows how to build a sequence that moves.shy. What the film occasionally struggles with is stillness, the quiet between the explosions. Leterrier is clearly more comfortable when things are in motion, and Clash of the Titans sometimes shows the seams of that preference. Scenes that should breathe instead accelerate. Moments that could land heavier if they were allowed to simply sit. But this tension between the movie that wants to be a meditation on human dignity versus the movie that really wants to show you a giant scorpion is actually one of the more interesting things about Clash of the Titans. Most blockbusters don't have that tension at all. They're fully committed to spectacle. This one is genuinely trying to do both things at once, and the friction of that effort produces some of the film's most memorable sequences. Now, the cast, because this is where the film makes a statement that goes beyond its budget. Liam Neeson as Zeus, Ralph Fiennes as Hades, Mads Mikkelsen as Draco, a career soldier with a world of experience in his eyes and almost no interest in explaining himself. Pete Postlethwaite as Spyros, that fisherman, Perseus' adoptive father, in a role that runs maybe 10 minutes of screen time total but carries enough warmth and lived-in humanity to anchor the entire first act emotionally. You believe in Perseus' love for that man. You believe in what he loses when Hades kills his adoptive family. You believe it because Postlethwaite makes you believe it, with minimal dialogue and an almost entirely physical performance. When that boat goes down and those people die, the movie earns Perseus' rage completely, and it earns it through an actor who was given barely any time to establish who these people were. E.T. Sam Worthington plays Perseus, and it's worth being honest about the complicated position the casting choice put the film in. Worthington had just come off Avatar, where he was, by design, something of a blank slate vessel for the audience to project themselves onto. That passivity worked beautifully in Cameron's film. It's a feature, not a bug, of how Avatar functions. In Clash of the Titans, it creates friction, because Perseus needs to feel like a man burning with unresolved fury, not a man waiting to receive instructions. Critics noticed this, and many of them weren't wrong. Time. But here's the thing about Worthington's performance that doesn't get enough credit. The flatness might be partially intentional, and it might even be correct. Perseus is a man in shock for most of this movie. His entire family is dead, his entire world, the fishing village, the boat, the rhythms of ordinary human life he loved, gone, in minutes, because a god decided to make a point. He isn't a warrior who springs into action with heroic certainty. He is a grieving man who has chosen rage over despair and forward motion over surrender. That's a specific emotional register, and if you watch the film with that lens, Worthington's controlled, simmering quality reads differently. Not boring, contained. Not passive, suspended. Then there's Ralph Fiennes as Hades, and if Worthington is the element critics wanted to debate, Fiennes is the element they almost universally agreed on. He is extraordinary in this role. He brings a hissing, whispering menace to a character who could easily be a cartoon villain, and instead delivers someone who feels genuinely dangerous, not because he's loud, but precisely because he isn't. We'll spend real time with Hades in this essay because the character is far more interesting than the film's surface-level bad guy framing suggests. Fiennes understood something about Hades that the script itself only half commits to, and what he does with that understanding elevates every scene he's in. This is also, it's worth saying plainly, a remake. The original Clash of the Titans from 1981, directed by Desmond Davis, is beloved by a generation of film lovers, not because it's perfect filmmaking, but because it contains the creature work of Ray Harryhausen, whose stop-motion effects gave those monsters something that no digital technique has ever quite replicated: personality. Harryhausen built those creatures by hand, frame by frame, over months of painstaking labor. The 1981 Medusa moves with a specific, mechanical, slightly uncanny quality that makes her feel genuinely alien. The original Kraken has a lumbering weight. Even Bubo, the mechanical owl that most modern viewers find embarrassingly camp, was made with love and craft and care. The 2010 version knew from the beginning it could never win that comparison on Harryhausen's terms. Stop motion and CG are different arts, not better or worse versions of the same art. So Leterrier and his 3 visual effects studios, Framestore, Cinesight, and the Moving Picture Company, all based in London, leaned hard into scale instead. The 2010 Medusa is a full-body performance, modeled on actress Natalia Vodianova, with a 50-foot snake body that morphs seamlessly into a human torso and a head capable of genuine facial expression. The Kraken, when it rises from the sea outside Argos, stands 700 feet above the waterline. A single claw brings down an entire city wall. These are different choices than Harryhausen made, not lesser ones. What's worth noting is the VFX context of the production itself. 3 major effects houses delivered hundreds of shots in less than 6 months. Framestore handled Medusa, the Hades effects, and the Olympus environment in 444 shots. Cinesight wrestled a 6-minute scorpion battle into existence. MPC managed Pegasus, the Kraken, and a fully CG city of Argos, complete with 32,000 digital trees and crowd simulations. The scale of that work, under that timeline, is genuinely staggering, and it's part of why, whatever the film's other problems, the spectacle holds up in ways that matter. But let's come back to what the film is actually about. Underneath the scorpions and the gods and the petrifying stare at Medusa, it's about a man who refuses to be a god. That's the engine. Perseus is the son of Zeus, a demigod, by birth more powerful than any human, and the entire film is structured around his repeated, almost stubborn refusal of that status. Zeus sends him a sword forged on Olympus, he refuses it. Zeus sends him golden armor, he refuses it. At the film's end, Zeus offers him a place among the gods. He says no. When Andromeda offers him the throne of Argos, he says no to that too. Every path that leads away from his mortality, toward power, toward divinity, Perseus turns away from it. In 2010, when the superhero industrial complex was shifting into full gear, when every blockbuster was about discovering you're exceptional, about the fantasy of transcendence and power, Perseus was doing the exact opposite. He was insisting that being human, merely human, is enough. That love and grief and a willingness to bleed are sufficient tools against divine cruelty. That mortality isn't a limitation to be overcome, it's the whole point. Whether Clash of the Titans executes that idea with the depth it deserves, or whether it gets distracted by its own set pieces, is a question this essay is going to chase all the way to the Kraken's last breath. The answer is complicated, and that complication is honestly more interesting than a simple great movie or bad movie verdict would be. There's also the matter of what this film is doing to Greek mythology itself, the particular choices it makes and who these gods are, how they work, and what their conflict with humanity actually means. There's something happening in this movie's mythology that is decidedly not Greek, and it's genuinely worth unpacking, because it tells you something fascinating about what 2010 Western audiences actually wanted when they sat down to watch ancient gods fight. We'll get there. All of it. The coffin is open. The baby is alive. Spyros is rowing home. Let's follow where this leads. Here's how the gods explain themselves at the beginning of Clash of the Titans. In a voiceover delivered with Liam Neeson's exact particular brand of solemn authority, humans built them. Not literally, not the way you'd build a temple, but existentially. Gods need worship to sustain their power, and humans are the ones who worship, which means the relationship between Olympus and Earth isn't one of creators and creation so much as performers and audience. The gods need the applause to survive. The humans need to believe in something larger than themselves. It's a transaction, a mutual dependency dressed up as divine hierarchy. That framing is doing enormous work for this film, and the movie sets it up fast, almost too fast, in its opening minutes. We get ancient battles, titans being defeated, gods rising to power. Perseus' origin, told in brief: Zeus came down to earth, disguised himself as a king, seduced the king's wife Danae, and Perseus was born. The king, furious, humiliated, uninterested in raising another man's child, even if that man was technically the king of the gods, sealed Danae and the infant Perseus in a chest and threw them into the sea, which is where we found them. In a coffin, in the nets of a fisherman named Spyros, who had no idea that the crying baby he just rescued from the Aegean was going to reshape the world. The brevity of this setup is interesting. The movie could have spent more time here, could have built the mythological architecture slowly, the way Game of Thrones might, or the way the original 1981 film did with its leisurely prologue. Instead, it trusts you to keep pace. It's a compressed world-building style that has real momentum to it. You're not given time to be confused, you're given just enough to be oriented, and then the ground is already moving under you. Perseus grows up on a fishing boat. That's the detail the film keeps returning to in its first act. Not the divine blood, not the prophecy that's apparently following him around like a persistent shadow, but the fact that he grew up at sea, doing work with his hands, surrounded by people who measured their lives in tides and weather and net weight. Spyros raised him. Marmara, his adoptive mother, raised him. His sister Pella was there. It was a good life by any standard that doesn't involve power or ambition. And then it ends. Hades arrives. And this is the scene that tells you exactly who Ralph Fiennes is playing. He doesn't come in thunder. He doesn't come in light. He comes as a figure of smoke and fragments, materializing out of shadows on the deck of a Roman warship, carrying himself with the loose, unnerving ease of something that has no reason to hurry because it already knows how this ends. The soldiers on that ship, hardened Roman warriors, are terrified before he says a word. That's the first piece of information we get about Hades. His mere presence disassembles people. Not his power, not his threats, his presence. He destroys the warship in seconds. The shockwave tears apart the surrounding fleet, and Spyros' fishing boat caught in the kill radius goes down with everyone on it. Marmara, Pela, everyone, gone. Perseus survives. He's dragged from the water by survivors, barely conscious. And what he's carrying when he comes around is not grief in the way a movie grief usually plays. There's no slow-motion crying, no trembling lip work, no soaring strings swelling up to tell you how to feel. Instead, there's just Worthington, jaw set, eyes hard, doing something more interesting than weeping, deciding. Grief and fury collapsing together into something that moves forward instead of inward. The fisherman's son is not going to sit down on the shore and process this. He's going to do something about it, even if the thing he can do is unclear, even if the enemy is literally a god. The survivors are marched to Argos, one of the great city-states of the ancient world, and here, the film opens up visually in a way it hasn't yet. Argos is built into a cliffside, massive and layered, its streets carved from the rock face, its harbor spread below it like a commercial empire in miniature. The production design by Martin Walsh gives the city a tangible weight. You believe in it as a functioning place, as a civilization with its own history and its own pride, which is important because Argos is about to be asked to choose between that pride and survival, and the choice it makes is the choice that drives everything. E.g., the city of Argos is at war with the gods. Not physically, not yet, but ideologically. Its soldiers have been tearing down statues of Zeus in the streets, chiseling the divine inscriptions off temple walls, refusing the rituals of prayer and sacrifice that feed Olympus its power. King Cepheus is passive about this rebellion, diplomatically hedging. But the city's momentum is with the insurgents, and their logic isn't unreasonable. The gods take and give back nothing useful. Why should men keep feeding a relationship this asymmetric? This is actually a pretty sophisticated political argument for an action movie, and the film doesn't fully abandon it. The debate about whether to resist the gods or comply with them runs underneath the story all the way to the ending, surfacing in different characters at different moments. Cepheus wants survival at the cost of dignity. The soldiers want dignity at the cost of survival. Perseus, when we get to his position on this, wants something else entirely. Not worship and not war, but a kind of defiant coexistence that the gods haven't been asked to accommodate before. The crisis point arrives at a public ceremony, in a scene that's worth watching carefully because it contains the film's essential dramatic trigger in under 2 minutes. Queen Cassiopeia, played by Polly Walker with the specific energy of someone who has always been the most beautiful person in every room she's ever entered and has been allowed to say whatever she likes because of it, stands before the assembled city and announces that her daughter Andromeda is more beautiful than Aphrodite herself. The air changes. It's a small moment, physically. Nobody strikes anyone. No weapon is drawn. But the offense is enormous. It's a direct insult to a goddess, hurled in public, by a queen whose city is already an active theological rebellion, and the film understands that the real violence in ancient mythology is often social before it's physical. The gods don't always punish immediately. They wait. They make you wonder. They let dread do the work for a while. Hades doesn't wait long. He erupts from the floor of the ceremony in that fragmentary way he has, smoke and malice, and he delivers his ultimatum with the theatrical precision of someone who has been rehearsing this moment. Sacrifice Andromeda, the princess, to the Kraken within 10 days. If not, the Kraken rises and destroys Argos entirely. No negotiation. No appeals process. 10 days. And then Perseus does something that genuinely startles Hades. You can see it in Phaena's reaction. A microsecond of adjustment, a recalibration. Perseus steps forward and says, essentially, I'm coming for you, and not as a demigod, as a man. It's the moment that breaks the logic of the world Hades inhabits. Gods don't get challenged by mortals. They get appeased, feared, bargained with, occasionally tricked. But a grieving fisherman's son planting his feet and offering himself as a weapon against the Olympian order is something Hades hasn't calculated for. And Phaena's plays the moment as genuine curiosity, a predator noticing something unexpected in its prey, rather than contempt. That choice matters. It means Hades takes Perseus seriously, as a threat from the beginning, which means the film's stakes are higher than they'd be if the antagonist simply dismissed the hero. After Hades departs, 2 figures step into Perseus's orbit that will shape everything from this point forward. The first is Io, played by Gemma Arterton. She's been watching Perseus for some time. Literally, she explains this, plainly, without apparent apology. She knows who he is, she knows what's coming, and she carries a quiet gravity that's completely distinct from every other character in the film, because Io is operating on a different timescale than anyone around her. She was cursed by a god, granted immortality as punishment rather than gift, which meant watching the people she loved die across centuries while she could not. She's not young, even though she looks it. She has the emotional weight of someone who has had a very long time to think about everything and come to terms with most of it. Arterton's performance is one of the genuinely underappreciated elements of Clash of the Titans. She plays Io with a stillness that could read as cold, but is actually something more textured. The stillness of someone who burned through panic and rage and sorrow a long time ago and arrived somewhere calmer on the other side. She believes in Perseus with a certainty that isn't romantic exactly, at least not initially. It's more like recognition. She's been waiting for someone who would fight this battle in this way, and she knows him when she sees him. The second figure is Draco, played by Mads Mikkelsen, commander of the King's Guard, career soldier, a man who has been at war so long that peace would genuinely confuse him. Mikkelsen brings something to this role that the script doesn't fully earn on the page, a physical and moral authority that makes Draco feel like the most competent person in any room he occupies. He doesn't waste words, doesn't perform confidence, doesn't explain himself. When Draco decides that Perseus is worth protecting, he protects him. When he decides Perseus needs a harder lesson, he provides that. His relationship with Perseus is the film's most interesting male dynamic. Not friendship exactly, but a kind of brutal mentorship that has genuine respect underneath its friction. Draco's unit of soldiers, Eusebios, Solon, Ixus, and the others, function as the film's ground-level chorus. They're not deeply individualized, but they're not supposed to be. What they represent is the ordinary human cost of extraordinary events. Men who signed up to guard a city and found themselves on a quest to kill Medusa instead, who have families and fears, and who die in the service of a mission that history might not record. The film is better when it remembers they exist. The quest is assembled quickly, almost necessarily so, because the 10-day clock starts ticking the moment Hades disappears and the film can't afford to linger. The city of Argos is in turmoil. Cepheus is paralyzed. Andromeda is quietly resigned, which is its own kind of courage. And Perseus, who still isn't sure what he can do, who has no training, no divine guidance he's willing to accept, and no plan beyond a general direction, says yes to the mission of finding a way to kill the Kraken. He says yes because the alternative is watching other people's families be destroyed the way his was. That's his entire motivation. It's not heroism in the classical sense. It's not glory-seeking or duty, following or fate, obeying. It's the decision of someone who has experienced a specific species of horror and refuses to let it propagate. That's a meaningful distinction. Perseus isn't a chosen hero who rises to his destiny. He's a furious man who chooses a dangerous direction and walks into it with both eyes open and no particular expectation of surviving. The road will take him through the Stygian Witches, across the desert, into the lair of Medusa herself, the one being whose gaze can petrify a Kraken. The plan is simple, almost absurdly simple. Get Medusa's severed head, bring it back, use it. The obstacles between here and that outcome are, to put it mildly, apocalyptic in scale. Io falls in beside him. Draco and his soldiers march at the perimeter. The city of Argos recedes behind them, still arguing about whether to fight or surrender, whether dignity or survival is the more important thing to protect. Perseus doesn't look back. The desert doesn't care about your quest. That's the first thing the landscape of Clash of the Titans communicates, once Perseus and his company leave Argos behind. The world outside city walls isn't dramatic in the operatic way of ancient epic. It isn't lit with divine purpose or arranged for narrative convenience. It's just vast and hot and indifferent. Sand and rock and open sky that makes a group of soldiers look very, very small. And there's something almost deliberately deflating about how the film handles the early stages of the journey. No swelling music announcing their departure into legend. No cutaways to Olympus signaling that fate is watching. Just men walking across hard ground, following a woman who has been alive long enough that she knows exactly what's out there, and a half-god who keeps refusing to be one. Io leads. That matters more than it initially seems. In a film full of men making decisions and gods issuing commands, Io is the one who actually knows the territory, literally and metaphysically. She has walked these roads before, in other lives, other centuries. When she speaks about what lies ahead, she isn't speculating, she's remembering. And Arterton plays those moments with a specific quality of exhausted accuracy, the way you'd describe a place you wish you'd never had to visit twice. The Stygian Witches come first, 3 of them. Old beyond any meaningful reckoning, sharing a single eye passed between them, a literal eye, passed from hand to hand, dropped into waiting palms, granting vision only to whoever currently possesses it. They see past and future with equal clarity, which hasn't made them wise exactly, just comprehensively unsurprised by everything. They live in a place the sun doesn't reach, crouched around the kind of fire that looks like it's been burning since before recorded time, speaking in the layered, overlapping cadence of something that has had a long time to synchronize with itself. Perseus steals the eye. That's the plan. Grab it mid-transfer, hold it hostage, extract the information about how to find Medusa and survive her lair. And the scene works primarily because of the tonal dissonance between what Perseus is actually doing, mugging 3 ancient supernatural beings for information, and the solemnity with which everyone involved treats it. The witches are genuinely threatening, even in their blindness, or maybe because of it. There's a scene where one of them reaches for the eye, and her fingers move with an assurance that suggests she doesn't need vision to find you, that she knows where you are by other means. The threat underneath is real, which makes Perseus's desperation feel real, which makes the exchange, information for eye, both parties unsatisfied, land as something more than a quest checklist item. The information they provide points toward the Isle of the Dead, Medusa's domain, the place where she was banished after Poseidon transformed her. A prison designed not for punishment, but for containment. Because a creature whose gaze turns living things to stone needs somewhere to be that isn't the middle of civilization. Getting there requires crossing through territory no rational person would choose to enter. Here's where Clash of the Titans introduces something genuinely unexpected: the Jinn. They appear at the edge of a desert encampment, figures made partly of blue flame and smoke, wrapped in dried wood and dark cloth, moving with an uncomfortable looseness that signals they're not anatomically arranged the way humans are. They're not Greek mythology at all. They're Islamic mysticism, transplanted wholesale into an ancient Aegean narrative. Desert spirits, elementals, beings of fire and desert origin that have exactly zero business being in a story about Zeus and Medusa. And the film doesn't really explain this. It doesn't offer a mythology-bridging rationale. It just introduces them, shows that they're deadly to ordinary soldiers but potentially useful as allies, and has Perseus, after initial confrontation, accept a specific jinn named Sheikh Suleiman into the group. Critics noticed the mythology mash-up, and they weren't wrong to note it. But the jinn serve a narrative function that's worth acknowledging separately from the mythological accuracy question. They represent the film's implicit argument that the ancient world was more interconnected and more culturally plural than the clean Greek-Roman mythology box often suggests. Whether you find that charming or frustrating probably depends on how invested you are in mythological purity. But the jinn, particularly Suleiman, deliver one of the film's most affecting moments later in the story, and their inclusion is easier to defend once you get there. Before Medusa, there are the scorpions. This deserves its own space because the giant scorpion battle in the desert is the sequence Clash of the Titans was made to deliver. A full-scale, mid-film action set piece that establishes the physical reality of the threat level before the story's climax. The scorpions emerge from the blood of the dying Calibos, a figure connected to Perseus's origin, who we'll come back to in the characters section, and they are enormous. Not movie big in the way that a director waves their hand and says, "It's big," but proportionally overwhelming in the way that good creature design is overwhelming, where the scale of the threat redraws your understanding of human vulnerability in real time. 3 visual effects. Teams contributed different elements to this battle, and the scorpion design itself went through extensive iteration at Framestore and the other facilities to ensure the creatures felt physically plausible even at their impossible scale. What the sequence gets right, and this is a literary strength as discussed, is the physical grammar of fighting something that large. You don't stand and hack at it. You run. You climb. You try to find angles that a creature with 8 legs and armored exoskeleton hasn't accounted for. The soldiers fight with a specific tactical desperation that makes the violence feel consequential rather than spectacular. And then the jinn, remarkably, become the solution. Their fire-based nature makes them effective against the scorpions in ways human weapons aren't, and watching the 2 groups, suspicious of each other 10 minutes ago, develop an impromptu combat coordination under lethal pressure is one of the film's few genuinely well-earned alliance moments. It doesn't make a big speech about it. It just happens, because desperation produces its own kind of trust. The Isle of the Dead. You feel it before you see it. The temperature drop, the quality of light shifting from harsh desert sun to something cooler and grayer, the way the water around the island moves differently, reluctant and heavy. The production design team built Medusa's lair as a ruined palace, columns toppled, roof partially collapsed, its floor plan deliberate. In a way that becomes clear only when you realize what it was designed for. It was designed to give Medusa angles, lines of sight, kill zones. The architecture of her prison is also the architecture of her hunting ground, and entering it voluntarily, knowing what she can do, requires a very specific kind of courage, or a very specific kind of recklessness. The soldiers split up to cover ground, which is, of course, exactly what you don't want them to do. The audience knows this, and the film leverages that knowledge beautifully. Every corridor is a potential point of no return. Every shadow holds the possibility of that specific horror. Not physical damage, not pain, but instantaneous, irrevocable transformation from living person into stone. There's something in the Medusa threat that's existentially worse than ordinary death, and the film communicates it effectively. Being killed means you cease. Being petrified means you remain. Frozen, permanent, a monument to the moment of your own terror. The soldiers who die this way don't disappear from the story. They're still there, in stone, which is its own kind of awful. Medusa herself is the film's single greatest achievement in creature design, and it isn't particularly close. She's built around the performance of actress Natalia Vodianova, whose movement was motion captured and then grafted onto the creature model, which means the way Medusa moves has an underlying human quality, a physical grammar that reads as feminine and deliberate, even as everything else about her is monstrous. Her lower body is a 50-foot serpent, scaled and powerful. Her hair is a mass of snakes, each independently mobile, each adding to the composite horror of her silhouette. Her face is where Framestore put its most careful work, capable of real expression, of something that reads disturbingly close to satisfaction when a soldier turns to stone. The lighting design in the Medusa sequence is deliberate and smart. The filmmakers and the VFX teams made a specific choice. Medusa is almost always in partial shadow, glimpsed rather than fully revealed, her presence suggested before it's shown. This isn't budget conservation, it's technique, and it's the right call. The imagination fills in what the frame withholds, and the horror of the character operates more powerfully in the space between shots than it would in a sustained, fully lit reveal. When you do see her clearly, it's in the moment before a kill, and the brevity of the clarity is itself terrifying. People die here. Good people. Characters the film has invested time establishing. Draco's soldiers fall one by one in the corridors, their names called out by surviving companions in a way that insists you remember they had names. The deaths don't feel gratuitous. They feel like the film honoring a principle. It established early there is no version of this quest where ordinary humans walk into a monster's lair and everyone walks out. The cost is paid in full. And then there's Draco himself. Mads Mikkelsen gets a death scene that is better than the film arguably earns. Draco takes an arrow from Medusa, who turns out to be an archer as well as a gorgon, which is a detail that feels almost unfairly stacked, and in his final moments does something that crystallizes everything the character has been building toward. He positions himself as a shield, deliberately, facing Medusa, buying Perseus the seconds he needs to act by using his own body as an obstacle. He doesn't close his eyes. He meets whatever's coming with the specific solidity of a man who decided a long time ago that he was all right with this kind of ending, if the ending meant something. It's a death that works because Mikkelsen has been establishing, quietly and without announcement throughout the second act, that Draco has no illusions about what this quest means. He signed up for it fully informed. He's not surprised by any of this. There's a dignity in that acceptance that the film earns through accumulation. Small moments in the desert, brief exchanges with Perseus, the way he watched the scorpion battle, not with fear, but with professional assessment, and Mikkelsen delivers the payoff without a single overwrought beat. Perseus gets Medusa's head. The mechanics of how he accomplishes this are clever, using his shield as a mirror, never looking directly, fighting her by reflection. And they're familiar, because they come from the actual myth, which is one of the moments where the film stays closest to its source material. But what the film adds, and what matters, is the weight Perseus carries out of that lair. He's holding a severed head wrapped in a bag, and he's surrounded by the stone statues of men who came in with him and won't be leaving the same way. The win doesn't feel like triumph, it feels like survival, which is different, grimmer, more honest. He walks out of the lair and into the gray light of the island's shore. The bag is heavy, the remaining soldiers are quiet. Io is there, and she looks at him with that specifically knowing expression she has. Not congratulation exactly, but acknowledgement. You did the thing. Now comes the harder part. Behind them, the island is still. Medusa's palace, full of stone soldiers, the Aegean surrounding them, unhurried and ancient, the Kraken, somewhere beneath all that water waiting for its 10 days to expire. Perseus doesn't celebrate, he just starts moving. The race back to Argos is not triumphant. That distinction matters enormously. Hollywood has a very specific language for the third act sprint toward climax. Swelling score, cutting momentum, the sense that everything is clicking into place with the satisfying inevitability of a well-oiled machine. Clash of the Titans denies you most of that. What Perseus and his surviving companions are carrying back to the city isn't glory. It's a bag with a head in it, and the men who helped carry it here are stone. The countdown clock is almost gone. The 10 days Hades granted Argos are expiring, and the city, unsurprisingly, given that it's been watching its gods turn on it with genuine force, has made a decision. It's going to comply. Andromeda will be sacrificed. The Kraken will be satisfied. The city will survive, diminished and frightened and forever altered by having chosen submission over defiance, but it will survive. This is exactly the political collapse that Cepheus was steering toward from the beginning of the film, a man who was never equipped to govern through genuine crisis, who confused caution with wisdom and found himself making the worst decision possible because every other option required a courage he simply didn't have. Andromeda accepts this. And this is one of the more underwritten but quietly interesting things the film does. Andromeda doesn't rage against her fate. She doesn't deliver a speech about injustice or beg for rescue. She dresses for sacrifice with a composure that reads as something between resignation and deliberate choice. As if she has decided that if her death is the price for her city's survival, she will pay it with whatever dignity she can manage. Alexa Davalos carries this without much dialogue support, with a stillness in her eyes that communicates interiority the script doesn't fully provide. It's a performance that's working harder than the material requires. Then there's Calibos. This is the film's most compressed but narratively significant confrontation before the final battle. Calibos, the deformed, embittered figure who has been pursuing Perseus through the second act, who exists as both personal antagonist and mythological echo of Perseus's own origin, catches up just as the group nears Argos. He's been sent by Hades, transformed from the nobleman Acrisius into something monstrous given purpose through corruption, weaponized through resentment. He stabs Perseus in the hand. Not fatally, deliberately, blood falls to the earth. And from that blood, scorpions emerge, because this is the kind of world where even your wounds have agency against you. The brief skirmish that follows is brutal precisely because it's small. No epic scale here, just two figures, one of them bleeding in a patch of rocky ground while the clock runs out. Perseus kills Calibos. And here is the moment that carries unexpected emotional weight. As Calibos dies, the transformation Hades imposed on him reverses. The monster recedes. What remains is Acrisius, the original man, the fisherman's original king, Perseus's biological grandfather in the film's mythology, lying on the ground, returning to something recognizably human in his final seconds. He dies as a man rather than a creature. Whether that constitutes mercy or tragedy depends on how you interpret what Hades' corruption took from him, and the film leaves that ambiguity intact rather than resolving it neatly. Perseus barely pauses. The city is visible on the horizon. The sky is changing. The Kraken rises. There is genuinely no other way to say this that does the sequence justice without simply describing what happens, because description is the only tool adequate to the scale of what the visual effects teams built here. The moving picture company modeled the Kraken at over 700 feet tall, taller than any building currently standing on Earth, with a physical design that fuses multiple mythological traditions into a single coherent horror. It emerges from the sea in sections, which is the right choice. You get a claw first, then the mass of its torso, then the full silhouette breaking the horizon line. And each reveal is larger than the one before it, in a way that keeps ratcheting your sense of scale before your mind can recalibrate. The city of Argos, that cliff-carved civilization the film spent the first act establishing as something real, something with history and weight, is suddenly very small. A single sweep of the Kraken's arm brings down walls that took generations to build. The harbor is destroyed in seconds. The city's harbor district, which the production design team built with genuine architectural specificity, is unmade in the same amount of time. This contrast, carefully established, casually destroyed, is the point. It's the film's most direct visual argument for why the war between men and gods is fundamentally unwinnable through conventional means. You can't outmuscle this. You can't outlast it. The only leverage a mortal has is something unexpected. Andromeda is chained to the cliff face above the water, which is the traditional sacrificial position from the source myth. Exposed, elevated, offering. The chain imagery is pointed. Civilization, faced with divine threat, literally chains up its best people and hands them over. Perseus is on Pegasus. This needs a moment because the relationship between Perseus and Pegasus is one of the film's few genuinely mythological pleasures, handled with more restraint than you'd expect. Pegasus doesn't come when called, doesn't arrive with dramatic convenience. Perseus earns the horse through a combination of persistence and something that functions almost like mutual recognition. Two creatures who don't fully belong in the world they're occupying, finding each other in the chaos. The training scene, brief as it is, works because Pegasus is rendered with enough behavioral specificity to feel like an animal rather than a vehicle. He has preferences. He pushes back. The partnership feels like something that required negotiation. In the air, the film becomes a different thing entirely. The ground-level grid of the quest, the sand and stone and physical attrition of 2 acts of travel, falls away, and what replaces it is an aerial grammar that MPC's animation team clearly relished constructing. The Kraken's scale reads differently from above than from the ground. From a human perspective, the creature is a wall of incomprehensible mass. From the air, on horseback, you can see its shape, the architecture of the thing, where the angles are, where the vulnerabilities might be hiding. Positions himself against the angle of the sun so the Kraken turns toward light to track him. Waits for the creature to open its impossible mouth in that specific way that creatures always open their mouths when they're about to destroy something. And then he drives Medusa's severed head directly into the Kraken's line of sight. Petrification moves through a creature that size like a wave. You see it in the VFX work. Stone spreading from the point of gaze outward, racing through the Kraken's body with a speed that seems fast, until you remember how much mass it needs to convert, and then seems almost slow. A limb freezes, then a torso. Then the whole impossibly large silhouette is locking into position, calcifying, the ocean churning around something that's becoming geology in real time. The Kraken doesn't scream. It doesn't have a villain's death. It simply stops, mid-motion, and then begins to collapse, and then collapses into the sea, into Argos. The impact is catastrophic even in victory, which is another one of the film's more honest choices. Killing the Kraken doesn't save the harbor. It doesn't restore what was already destroyed. It just stops more destruction from happening. The difference between winning and the damage being done is something the film actually sits with for a moment, in the brief pause after the creature falls and before the next sequence begins. Andromeda is unchained. She's alive. The city still stands, mostly. Perseus confronts Hades. This confrontation, on a stone promontory above the ruined city, is the emotional climax the entire film has been building toward, and it's worth noting that it's not a physical battle in the traditional sense. Hades doesn't lose because Perseus outfights him. He loses because Perseus denies him the one thing that sustains him, fear. The film has been quietly establishing throughout the story that Hades draws power specifically from human terror. He fed on the fear in Argos, was strengthened by the city's panic, grew more dangerous the more desperate the situation became. When Perseus faces him without being afraid, when he uses the last of Medusa's power to drive Hades back, he isn't destroying Hades so much as withdrawing the emotional sustenance the god has been consuming. Fiennes plays this defeat with exactly the right register, not rage, not theatrical villainy, but a cold, precise acknowledgement that the calculus has changed. He retreats to the underworld. He doesn't die, and this matters. Hades returns in the sequel, and the film is smart enough not to pretend that a mortal can permanently defeat a god through sheer will. What Perseus achieves is a withdrawal, not an elimination. The problem doesn't end. It pauses. Then comes the decision that the film has been structuring itself around since the fisherman pulled an infant from the sea. Zeus appears. Liam Neeson, resplendent in the white light that the film uses specifically for Zeus's divine appearances, and offers Perseus a place on Olympus. Godhood, immortality, the permanent solution to all the vulnerability and loss that being human entails. And Perseus says no. He says it quietly, not dramatically, not with a speech, just no. He wants to live on Earth among humans as one of them. The life Spyros gave him, the fishing village, the boat, the rhythms of a life measured in physical reality rather than divine permanence, was a good life. Becoming something more powerful than human isn't an upgrade from Perseus's perspective. It's a different species of loss. Zeus, in what reads as a genuine concession, an acknowledgement that his son has shown him something about humanity that the gods have been undervaluing, offers one gift instead. He resurrects Io. And here's what that choice reveals about Zeus's character, which the film has been building more quietly than it gets credit for. Zeus isn't simply the good god to Hades' bad god. He's been manipulating events throughout, enabling Perseus's quest, withholding help when it suited him, allowing his son to suffer losses that might have been preventable. The resurrection of Io is partly genuine love. It's also guilt. Liam Neeson plays those two things simultaneously in the scene, warmth and something heavier underneath it, and the combination gives Zeus a moral complexity the film occasionally seems uncertain about committing to fully. Io opens her eyes on a cliff top above Argos. Perseus is there. The horse is there. The horse is there. The city is rebuilding below them. Andromeda watches from a distance, and this is the film's final and most pointed refusal of convention. Perseus doesn't end up with the princess. He doesn't take the throne. He doesn't accept the political reward that the narrative logic of heroic fantasy says he's earned. He rides away with Io, the woman who is immortal, who has been watching history long enough to understand what this moment means, who chose to believe in him before anyone else did. Below them, Argos begins its long process of figuring out how to rebuild, not just the harbor and the walls, but the worldview. The city that tore down statues of Zeus and declared itself beyond the gods has learned something complicated. The gods are real, and they're dangerous, and defiance is both necessary and costly. What you do with that knowledge, how you live inside that tension, that's the question the film leaves with you rather than resolving. Perseus rides toward the horizon, not a god, not a king. A man on a winged horse, alive against all reasonable expectation, choosing the one thing that Olympus can't give him and can't take away. The ordinary life, however long it lasts, the ordinary life. Perseus chose it. And that choice, as dramatically satisfying as it is in the moment, only means something if you've spent the preceding 106 minutes understanding why he'd choose it. Why a man with access to divine power, divine armor, divine weapons, and a standing invitation to Olympus would turn all of it down and ride away on a horse. The answer isn't in the plot mechanics, it's in what Sam Worthington builds. Quietly, imperfectly, with more deliberateness than the film's reputation suggests. across every scene from the fishing boat to the clifftop. Clash of the Titans lives and dies by its characters in a way that blockbusters of its era rarely had to reckon with. The spectacle could carry the weekend opening. What kept audiences, or didn't, was whether the human material between the set pieces made them care about who was holding the weapon, and the film has a genuinely strong hand of performers to play with. What's interesting isn't that the cast is good, it's where each performer exceeded their material and where the material let them down, because that gap, in almost every case, tells you something specific about what Clash of the Titans was and what it was reaching toward without quite grasping. Perseus, Sam Worthington. Let's start with the most contested element in any conversation about this film. Sam Worthington's Perseus was, at the time of release, almost universally criticized for a specific quality that critics reached for different words to describe: flat, blank, wooden, passive, emotionally unavailable. The Australian accent that periodically bled through the attempt at a neutral mid-Atlantic delivery became a running observation. The hair, buzz-cut, contemporary, completely at odds with the mythological setting, was treated as a symptom of a larger problem, as if even the production design couldn't decide what century this man belonged to. Some of that criticism was fair. Some of it missed what was actually happening. Start with what's undeniably true. Worthington is not a maximalist actor. He doesn't signal emotion in advance. He doesn't telegraph interiority through facial gymnastics or vocal modulation. In a genre where leading men were increasingly expected to be charismatic in a very specific, extroverted Tony Stark-adjacent way, Worthington was doing something quieter, and quieter reads as lesser when the audience has been conditioned to expect performance volume. But watch the film specifically attending to Worthington's body language, and a different picture emerges. Perseus carries himself with a physicality that changes across the story's arc in ways that are actually quite precise. Early, Perseus. Fishing village. Perseus moves with the loose ease of someone at home in his body, comfortable in his environment. The moment after his family dies, something tightens in his posture. His shoulders pull inward slightly. He begins to carry weight that isn't physical. That's not blank. That's a performer making specific choices about how grief manifests in a man who isn't going to cry, who has nowhere to put the feeling except into forward motion. The scene where Zeus offers him the golden sword and he refuses it is worth watching several times. What Worthington is playing in that moment isn't pride or stubbornness, though it looks like both. He's playing disconnection, a man who cannot accept a gift from the father who caused the death of the people he actually loved. The rejection isn't strategic, it's almost allergic. The divine paraphernalia reminds him of the divine machinery that killed Spyros and Marmara and Pela, and he can't touch it without touching that grief, so he doesn't touch it. Worthington communicates this entirely through stillness and a single sustained look at the sword that has more emotional content than a monologue would. Where the performance falls short, genuinely, not just by comparison to louder actors, is in the film's few moments that require Perseus to be charming. The brief attempts at humor, the developing rapport with Io, the tentative command authority he's supposed to establish with Draco's soldiers, these moments need a warmth that Worthington's instrument doesn't always access in this particular role. The fisherman's son who laughs easily, who connects naturally, who earns loyalty through personality as much as capability, that version of Perseus is described more than it's performed. You hear about that man's qualities. You don't always feel them. The result is a protagonist who works best as a vehicle for the film's central philosophical argument, the human who refuses divinity and works least when the script asks him to be conventionally heroic. That's a specific and somewhat limiting strength, but it's a real one, and it means that every scene where Perseus's humanity is tested rather than his capability, the family deaths, the refusal of gifts, the final choice, Worthington delivers exactly what the film needs. Hades, Ralph Fiennes. Here is where the film unambiguously exceeds its apparent ambitions. Ralph Fiennes took the role of Hades with a very specific interpretation that the script partially supports and partially transcends, and the gap between what the screenplay gave him and what he brought to it is one of the more fascinating case studies in performance-elevating material in contemporary blockbuster filmmaking. On paper, Hades could easily be a straight villain, the scheming god of death, manipulating events from below, powered by fear, planning to overthrow Zeus and take Olympus for himself. That motivation is present in the film, but Fiennes plays Hades with a layer underneath the scheming that reframes the character entirely. He plays a god who is exhausted, not tired in a mortal physical sense. Exhausted in the way that something ancient and immensely powerful gets exhausted when it has been given the worst job in existence and made responsible for a dimension of existence that nobody, not mortals, not the other gods, wants to think about for millennia without relief. Zeus and Poseidon got the sky and the sea. Hades got death. He got darkness. He got the place everything eventually ends up, and the company of the grief-stricken and the lost. And then, to add genuine structural injustice to the situation, he was cut off from the one thing that sustains gods: worship. Because nobody prays to Hades. Nobody builds temples to him and fills them with music and offerings. They pray to avoid him. They worship every other god specifically in hopes of delaying the moment they enter his domain. Fiennes builds this into every scene, not through exposition, not through dialogue that explains it, but through the specific quality of weariness in his movements, the way he seems to regard the mortal world with something closer to contempt born of envy than simple malice. When Hades hisses at the assembled court of Argos, when he materializes in fragments of shadow and smoke, there's a controlled fury underneath the theatricality that reads as someone who has been held at a distance from everything he was promised and has finally decided to stop being patient. His voice is the primary instrument. Fiennes deploys it as precisely as a surgeon deploys a scalpel, soft when threat is most present, sibilant in ways that make the air feel unsafe, building to moments of genuine volume that hit harder because they've been withheld so long. The specific cadence he found for Hades, clipped, deliberate, each word separated as if he's deciding in real time whether to say the next one, creates a constant low-level tension in every scene he inhabits. You don't know what he's going to do. More unusually for a blockbuster villain, you don't know why he's going to do it, and that uncertainty is far more unsettling than straightforward menace. What Fiennes doesn't do, and this is the choice that makes the performance, is indicate. He never plays evil. He never signals to the audience that Hades is the bad guy through winks or exaggerated affect. He plays a being with genuine motivation and genuine grievance, who has made a series of choices that have placed him in direct opposition to the film's protagonist. The result is a villain who is more interesting the more you think about him, rather than less. The one scene that crystallizes this most completely is Hades' confrontation with Zeus on Olympus. Fiennes and Neeson, two immensely skilled classical actors, across a gleaming marble table, one of them seething and the other radiating authority. It's brief. The film doesn't linger. But in those few minutes, you feel the entire weight of their relationship, brothers who built the world together and then divided it in a way that neither of them has fully made peace with. That's centuries of dynamic in a single exchange, and both actors bring every year of it. Zeus. Liam Neeson. Zeus is the film's most complicated moral figure, and the movie doesn't always know what to do with that complication. On the surface, Zeus is positioned as the god who loves humanity, who created them, who draws sustenance from their worship, who genuinely wants his son to succeed, opposed to Hades, who feeds on fear and wants to weaponize the Kraken. Good god, bad god. Straightforward, except that's not quite what Liam Neeson plays, and it's not quite what the film actually depicts when you follow the narrative logic carefully. Zeus knew Perseus was alive and in danger. He sent resources in the form of the sword and armor. Resources. Perseus refused, but that were offered. He watched the fishing village be destroyed without intervening. He allowed his son to suffer consequences that a king of the gods' intervention could have prevented, on what seems to be the principle that Perseus needed to find his own strength without divine assistance. That framing can be read as loving restraint. It can also be read as divine negligence, dressed in the language of pedagogy. Neeson finds the seam between those two interpretations and lives in it, playing Zeus, not as evil, not as benevolent, but as someone who genuinely believes in Perseus while also genuinely accepting costs in Perseus's life that a loving father would have refused to accept. There's a specific scene where Zeus watches Perseus's quest from Olympus with an expression that Neeson plays as pain, real pain, not performative celestial concern. And the pain is genuine, precisely because Zeus chose this, chose to watch rather than intervene, and is now living with the texture of that choice. The physical presence Neeson brings to Zeus is also important. He wears the god's light and armor with complete ease. There's no sense of an actor in a costume, which with this much literal, glowing, white production design would be an easy failure mode. Zeus inhabits the visual language of divinity naturally, which makes his emotional moments land harder. When this being who fills a room with light and authority shows something vulnerable, it means something. I.O. Gemma Arterton. I.O. is the character the film most consistently underserves on the script level and most consistently saves through performance. Her function in the narrative is partially guide, partially conscience, partially romantic interest, a trifecta of supporting character roles that, in lesser hands, would flatten into pure utility. What Arterton does with the role is find the one specific thing that makes Io genuinely singular rather than functional. She plays someone who has been alive long enough that she has stopped being surprised by humanity and started being genuinely moved by it. The immortality Io carries isn't a superpower. It's the film's closest thing to a curse presented without tragedy, opera framing, because the tragedy of Io's condition isn't dramatic in the conventional sense. She didn't lose her mortality in a moment of spectacular divine cruelty. She simply stopped aging, watched the people she loved die at normal human rates, and continued. And continued. And continued. Arterton plays the result not as perpetual grief. She's moved past that, the film implies, centuries ago, but as a kind of heightened attention to the present. When Io looks at Perseus, she looks with the full weight of someone who knows how fast a human life moves and has decided not to waste the looking. Her death scene, Calibos stabs her in the second act when she steps between him and Perseus, is the film's most emotionally direct moment, and it works because Arterton has been spending the entire runtime building toward it without announcing she's building toward it. The scene doesn't linger in manipulation. It's brief, clean, and carries enormous weight. And then Zeus undoes it at the end, which raises interesting questions about the economy of sacrifice in a world where gods can reverse death if they choose to, questions the film raises without quite examining. What the film does correctly with Io is resist making her purely romantic. Her belief in Perseus predates any romantic feeling and would exist regardless of whether any romantic feeling developed. She chose him as a mission before she chose him as a person, and those two things sit alongside each other in the performance without collapsing into each other. Draco, Mads Mikkelsen. Mads Mikkelsen is doing something in Clash of the Titans that Mads Mikkelsen tends to do in every project he brings his full attention to. He's making a character who exists on the page as a function into a person who exists on screen as a presence. Draco has maybe 30 lines of meaningful dialogue in the entire film. His character arc, described flatly, is experienced soldier assigned to protect guide Perseus, develops grudging respect for him, dies protecting him in Medusa's lair. That's the map. It's not a particularly rich map. What Mikkelsen adds is everything the map doesn't include. He constructs Draco's interior life entirely through physical means, the way Draco watches situations before responding to them, the specific economy of his movement, never wasted, always purposeful, the quality of attention he brings to assessing his environment versus the quality he brings to assessing people. Draco is a man who has spent so long in dangerous places that danger has become information rather than threat. He reads it the way a skilled craftsperson reads their materials, without alarm, but without dismissal either. His relationship with Perseus develops through increments so small, they're easy to miss. It's not the traditional reluctant mentor becomes proud father arc, though it has elements of that. It's more like two people who initially have no language for understanding each other. Perseus refuses the entire framework. Draco operates within, the framework of rank and discipline and earned authority, slowly finding a specific, narrow overlap where their values align. Both of them, it turns out, believe that the way you die matters, that there's a difference between a death that means something and one that doesn't. The mission gives them that shared belief, and Mikkelsen builds toward the death scene by making Draco a man for whom that conviction isn't philosophy, but practice. His death works because it isn't performed as sacrifice. Draco doesn't make the face of noble self-offering. He makes the face of a soldier who has found the moment he was designed for and is doing it correctly. The distinction is everything. The supporting cast, everybody else, briefly, because the film's other performers deserve acknowledgement even if the script gives them limited material. Nicholas Hoult appears as Eusebios, one of Draco's soldiers, young, slightly wide-eyed, serving primarily as the audience's point-of-view character in the unit, the one most visibly terrified by what they're walking into. Hoult, even at this early stage of a career that would expand significantly, brings a specific nervous intelligence to the role that makes Eusebios' fear feel thoughtful rather than cowardly. He's scared because he's paid attention to what they're up against, which is the most honest response to the situation. Pete Postlethwaite as Spyros, as established in earlier sections, does more with less screen time than almost any other performer in the film. He makes the fishing village real. He makes the family real. He makes Perseus' loss real before the loss happens, which is the only way that loss can function dramatically. Polly Walker's Cassiopeia is brief but precise. She plays a woman who has never been denied anything, and consequently has no working theory of consequence. The boast that triggers the entire plot isn't stupidity. It's the logical result of a lifetime of impunity. Walker plays that entitlement with a lightness that makes it more alarming than a heavy-handed reading would. Moulad Akor's Sheikh Suleiman, leader of the Jinn, carries himself with a dignified inscrutability that the film doesn't adequately reward with screen time or dialogue. The character deserved more, and the performance makes you feel that absence. What emerges from the full character ensemble of Clash of the Titans is a film that casts itself with considerably more ambition than it's given credit for. Worthington, Fiennes, Neeson, Arterton, Mikkelsen. These are not the generic leading man choices of a studio action product. These are actors who require the material to meet them, and when the material does, the results are genuinely compelling. When it doesn't, when the script retreats to function and lets the spectacle substitute for interiority, the performers find ways to carry the weight through craft alone. The craft is visible if you look for it, and looking for it makes Clash of the Titans a richer film than its surface suggests, which is, in a way, exactly what Perseus keeps trying to tell everyone about being merely human. The depth isn't announced. You have to do the work of seeing it. The depth isn't announced. That's true of the performances. It's also, in a completely different register, true of the technical work underneath Clash of the Titans. Work that was extraordinary in several respects, compromised in one spectacular and historically significant respect, and responsible for a conversation about how Hollywood makes movies that continued for years after the film left theaters. Let's start with what worked. Then we'll get to the scandal, because the scandal deserves its own space. The VFX pipeline, 3 studios, one impossible schedule, when Louis Leterrier and Warner Brothers greenlit the visual effects approach for Clash of the Titans. They were making a decision that would require 3 separate major facilities, Framestore, Cinesite, and the Moving Picture Company, all based in London, to deliver somewhere in the range of 1,300 individual VFX shots across a production pipeline of less than 6 months for key sequences. That timeline, for that volume of work, at that level of complexity, was not comfortable by any standard. It was the kind of schedule that requires every department to be running at full capacity simultaneously, with almost no room for the kind of iterative revision that produces the best visual effects work. That this pressure is largely invisible in the finished film is the first technical achievement worth acknowledging. Framestore took responsibility for what was arguably the most critically important creature in the film, Medusa. Their approach began with a performance foundation. Actress Natalia Vodyanov's movement was motion captured and used as the behavioral skeleton for the creature model, which is why the way Medusa moves has that disturbing underlying human quality even as the surface is wholly monstrous. The rigging team at Framestore faced a specific technical challenge that the finished sequence makes look effortless. Medusa's hair is not decorative, it's functional, menacing, and independently mobile. Dozens of individual snakes, each with its own behavioral logic, each capable of reacting to its environment, all needing to read as a coherent mass rather than a CGI demonstration reel. Getting the hair to feel like weight and threat simultaneously rather than just visual noise required the kind of simulation work that audiences never consciously notice and would immediately notice if it were absent. The specific technical decision that elevates the Medusa sequence beyond standard creature work is the lighting approach. Framestore, working with cinematographer Peter Menzies Jr., made a deliberate choice to keep Medusa in shadow for most of her screen time. Glimpsed in portions, revealed incrementally, fully lit only in the milliseconds before a kill. This wasn't a budget or time constraint masquerading as artistic choice. It was a studied decision rooted in an understanding of how visual information generates fear. A fully visible, fully lit creature is a known quantity. The audience's imagination stops filling in the spaces. What Framestore and Menzies understood is that the spaces the camera refuses to fill are doing active work, and that the horror of Medusa lives in the peripheral, the suggested, the incomplete reveal. For context, a medium-scale visual effects film of the period might have 250-400 effects shots in its entirety. Framestore delivered that volume for 3 discrete sequences in the same film. Cinesite handled the Scorpion battle, a 6-minute sequence that presented an entirely different category of technical challenge, because scorpions fight differently than singular creatures. There are multiple of them. They move, they break apart, they interact with the terrain and with each other and with the human soldier simultaneously. The creature design went through significant iteration to arrive at something that felt biologically coherent at impossible scale, because the instinct when designing giant versions of real creatures is to simply enlarge them proportionally, and the problem is that biological physics doesn't scale that way. A scorpion the size of a building would move differently than a scorpion the size of a hand, and the simulation team had to find a movement grammar that split the difference between physical plausibility and visual readability. What Cinesite got right, and this feeds back to what was discussed about Leterrier's action staging strengths, is the spatial logic of the fight. You always know where the soldiers are relative to the scorpions. You always understand why a particular attack vector is dangerous and why a different one might create opportunity. The choreography between the real stunt performers and the digital creatures was engineered so that the practical and digital elements read as genuinely occupying the same physical space, which is the fundamental challenge of human versus creature action sequences and the thing that most easily breaks the illusion when it fails. The moving picture company took on the work that defined the film's scale: Pegasus, the Kraken, and the fully CG reconstruction of Argos. The Kraken alone involved a creature model of unprecedented size within the production, requiring MPC to essentially build new pipeline tools for rendering a figure 700 feet tall with sufficient surface detail to hold up in close-up shots alongside the Argos environment. The city build required 32,000 individually modeled digital trees, detailed architectural work on a cliff-carved civilization that needed to feel centuries old, and crowd simulation systems capable of populating the streets with fleeing civilians at the scale the sequence demanded. Pegasus, by contrast, was the intimate challenge, a creature that needed to read as an animal, not a vehicle, a living thing with its own behavioral logic. MPC built the horse's movement around real equine reference footage and then extended it into flight physics in a way that preserved the underlying naturalism. The wings aren't just attached to a horse. They're integrated into the creature's musculature in a way that makes the flight mechanics feel anatomically committed to, even though they're physically impossible. When Pegasus banks or climbs, you feel the weight distribution shifting. That's the detail work, and it's why the aerial sequences in the third act feel genuinely kinetic, rather than digitally weightless. PET. Menzies, Jr. Cinematography. Peter Menzies, Jr. brought a visual philosophy to Clash of the Titans that's worth examining independently of the VFX work it informed. His approach was rooted in scale contrast, placing human figures against environments designed to dwarf them, using the ratio between body and background as a constant visual argument for the film's central theme. Individuals are small in a world where gods are real. The early desert sequences use wide, flat horizon lines that emphasize the absence of shelter, the vulnerability of the group in open terrain. Argos, by contrast, is always shot from angles that stack it vertically. Layers of city above, layers of city, the perspective forcing your eye upward and communicating ambition and civilization simultaneously. The Isle of the Dead uses a desaturated palette that strips warmth from the image, making the already cold premise feel colder, making every shadow feel occupied even when it isn't. Menzies' collaboration with Leterrier on the action sequences reflects the director's strength, camera placement that prioritizes spatial clarity over visual excitement. During the Scorpion battle, the camera's position is always serving comprehension. You can track the fight, you can maintain your understanding of who is where and what the immediate danger is. This seems obvious, but it's actually a specific directorial discipline that many action filmmakers abandon in favor of the visual energy of rapid cutting and disorienting proximity. Leterrier and Menzies trusted that a sequence you can follow is more exciting than a sequence you can feel but not read. Ramin Djawadi. The score. Ramin Djawadi composed the score for Clash of the Titans in 2010, the same year he delivered the first season of Game of Thrones, which would eventually become one of the most celebrated television scores of the century. The two projects share a tonal DNA, orchestral muscle, propulsive momentum, a willingness to use silence as a compositional tool rather than empty space. The Clash of the Titans score works in two distinct modes. The first is the epic action mode, broad orchestral surges that give the set pieces their sense of scale, brass-heavy and kinetic, building in the tradition of classical adventure scoring from Williams through Zimmer without being derivative of either. The Scorpion battle's musical track drives the sequence's pacing in a way that's easy to take for granted. The editing rhythm and the compositional rhythm are in genuine dialogue, each one informing the other's tempo, creating a unified sense of forward momentum that neither element could achieve independently. The second mode is more interesting and less discussed, the quiet mythological mode. The moments between action. Io speaking about her curse, Perseus on the boat with Spyros in the early scenes, the group crossing the desert in silence, are underscored with something more restrained and ancient feeling, themes that have the quality of half-remembered folk music, modal rather than major-minor in their harmonic structure, suggesting a world where the emotional vocabulary predates the one we currently use. Djawadi was clearly thinking about what the music of the ancient world might have meant to people for whom the gods were not metaphor but physical fact, and while the score can't escape its Hollywood orchestral context entirely, the impulse towards something more genuinely archaic is audible and affecting. The Zeus theme, given to Neeson's appearances, is appropriately overwhelming. The Hades material leans into lower registers, strings, and brass operating below their comfortable ranges, creating a sound that feels geologically deep. The musical characterization follows the visual logic of both gods. Zeus is light and altitude, Hades is depth and cold. Lois Leterrier. Direction style. It's worth addressing Leterrier's directorial approach as a distinct element, rather than simply as the context for the VFX and performance work. Leterrier is a kinetic director in the most literal sense. His camera is almost always in motion, finding angles through movement rather than through static composition. His background in action-focused European filmmaking gives him a particular fluency with bodies in space, a comfort with the grammar of physical confrontation that American action directors sometimes over-choreograph into sterility. The fights in Clash of the Titans feel rough in productive ways. Impact reads as impact. The violence of the Scorpion sequence has genuine physical weight. Even the Medusa chase, which is a fundamentally digital construction, carries a sense of bodily stakes, because Leterrier and Menzies were thinking about where the camera would be if this were a practical stunt rather than a CG environment. Where Leterrier's approach creates problems is in the connective tissue between sequences. The film has a pace issue in its middle section that is specifically a directorial problem, rather than a script or VFX problem. Scenes that should decelerate enough to allow the emotional investments being made to register keep accelerating past their own content. Io's backstory. These need breathing room that the film's cutting rhythm often doesn't provide. Leterrier seems more comfortable with the challenge of making something move than with the challenge of making something still. This is the tension that runs through the entire film at a directorial level. The same tension visible in the VFX decisions, the same tension present in the character work. Clash of the Titans is a film that was reaching towards something more contemplative than its genre framework typically allows, directed by someone whose instincts are fundamentally kinetic. The result is a film that's best in motion and slightly uneasy at rest, which is honestly not the worst thing a blockbuster can be. It just means the film's depths require more active pursuit than its surface. The 3D Candle, a watershed moment in Hollywood history now. Here we are. The story of Clash of the Titans in 3D is, in the annals of modern Hollywood, one of the most instructive and unambiguous case studies in the collision between commercial opportunity and artistic integrity. It needs to be told completely because it didn't just affect this film, it shaped how the industry thought about post-conversion 3D for the remainder of the decade. The context, James Cameron's Avatar opened in December 2009 and earned $2.8 billion worldwide. It was shot natively in 3D using Cameron's own Fusion camera system, purpose-built to capture stereoscopic depth with an unprecedented quality. The 3D was not a gimmick. It was an architectural decision that Cameron had been planning for over a decade, integrated into the film's visual grammar from the first day of photography. The result was a 3D experience that genuinely added dimensionality, rather than simply adding ticket costs. Warner Brothers, watching Avatar's numbers, made a decision in January 2010. Approximately 10 weeks before Clash of the Titans was scheduled to open on April 2nd, to convert the already completed film to 3D. The film had been shot entirely in 2D. There was no stereoscopic information in the image. Creating 3D from 2D footage requires a conversion process that is time-consuming, technically demanding, and at best an approximation. The parallax information that native 3D captures with cameras isn't present, and the conversion software has to estimate it. A process that becomes visible as distortion in fast movement sequences and in any shot with complex depth layering. 10 weeks is not enough time to do this well. The conversion vendor, Prime Focus, was given an impossible brief: convert a feature film with extensive action sequences, complex VFX elements, rapid cutting, and numerous scenes of fast lateral movement, exactly the conditions under which post-conversion artifacts become most visible. In a timeline that would require cutting corners at every stage of a process that cannot afford to cut corners without the audience noticing. The result was, by near universal consensus among critics and audiences, and eventually the filmmakers themselves, a disaster. Roger Ebert, reviewing the film, wrote that he recommended watching it in 2D if at all possible, and spent more of his review discussing the 3D problem than many of the film's actual narrative elements. Critics who covered the theatrical experience made the post-conversion quality a centerpiece of their assessment. The 3D was described as muddy, flat, dark being the consistent and technically accurate complaint, because adding the 3D conversion requires significant light reduction to maintain the illusion, which stripped the brightness from Menzies' cinematography and made night sequences and interior scenes nearly illegible. James Cameron, the man who had just made the 3D experience people were trying to replicate, publicly criticized the Clash of the Titans conversion, making clear that the results were damaging to the perception of 3D filmmaking more broadly. Cameron's investment in 3D as a legitimate artistic medium gave his criticism particular weight. He wasn't opposing a competitor. He was defending a technology he believed in from being associated with work that didn't represent it. Most devastating of all, Louis Leterrier himself expressed dissatisfaction with the conversion. The director of the film said publicly that he was not happy with what was done to it in post-production, a remarkable statement for a director to make about their own theatrical release, and one that signals how significant the breach was between what the production intended and what audiences received. The premium ticket pricing for the 3D version, which audiences paid, given the $493 million gross, added a layer of controversy that went beyond aesthetic disappointment into something closer to consumer anger. People paid more to see less, essentially. They paid a 3D surcharge to watch a dimmer, more distorted version of a film that looked better in standard 2D. The disconnect between price and quality became a talking point that extended well beyond film criticism into mainstream media and audience conversation. The industry-level impact was lasting. The Clash of the Titans 3D conversion became a reference point for what not to do, a teachable example of how the chase for premium revenue can actively harm a film's reception and damage audience trust in a format. Subsequent post-conversion projects were evaluated against its failure as a baseline. Studios became, at least temporarily, more cautious about announcing late-stage 3D decisions. Directors became more vocal about their preferences regarding dimensional format, understanding that a conversion done without their involvement could override their visual intentions in ways that would be publicly associated with their work. The sequel, Wrath of the Titans in 2012, was also converted to 3D, but with significantly more lead time and more deliberate integration of the format into the production process, and the results were considerably better received. The lesson from Clash of the Titans had been absorbed, at least in this specific franchise. Whether Hollywood absorbed it more broadly is a longer conversation. What's worth sitting with, as we consider the technical legacy of this film, is the specific injustice of it. The VFX work delivered by Framestore, Cinesight, and MPC was genuinely impressive. Menzies' cinematography was purposeful and skilled. Jawadi's score served the film's emotional architecture. Leterrier's action direction was effective. All of that work, months of craft and expertise in problem-solving, was degraded by a 10-week post-production decision made purely for commercial reasons, without the knowledge or consent of the people who made it. The film that audiences received in 3D was not the film the production team made. It was a revenue optimization of it. And the fact that the film still earned $493 million worldwide, that it still reached its audience, that the craft beneath the conversion damage is still visible when you watch it in the format it was actually designed for. That's either a testament to the resilience of the underlying work or a measure of how much the industry was willing to accept in exchange for a premium ticket price. Probably both. Here is the paradox. At the center of the Lightning Thief's cultural life, it succeeded well enough to be considered a failure. That sentence needs unpacking because it's genuinely strange. $226 million worldwide on a $95 million production budget is, by any neutral accounting, a commercially successful film. A B-plus cinema score from opening weekend audiences means the people who actually bought tickets and sat in the dark and watched it left the theater satisfied. DVD sales of over 2 million units in the first year means it found a secondary life after theatrical release, reaching the audience that always mattered most. The kids at home, watching on repeat, wearing out their copies the way kids do when something becomes theirs. By these measures, The Lightning Thief worked. But Hollywood in 2010 was not evaluating movies by neutral accounting. It was evaluating them against the franchise template, specifically the Harry Potter template, which demanded not just profitability but cultural dominance, not just an audience but a phenomenon. And against that standard, The Lightning Thief's numbers read as underperformance. The opening weekend of $31.1 million was respectable but not seismic. The critical reception at 48% on Rotten Tomatoes meant the prestige press wasn't going to drive word of mouth. The comparison to Sorcerer's Stone's $90 million domestic opening made everything else look like a consolation prize. What this reveals is less about The Lightning Thief specifically, and more about the specific trap of the franchise industrial complex. When you position a film as the next chapter in a genre, rather than as a thing unto itself, you've surrendered the terms of its evaluation before it opened. The film could only be judged as a lesser version of what came before, because that's the frame the marketing built around it. A different framing. This is a new mythology, a new world, a new kind of hero. Might have produced a different critical conversation. It might not have. But it would have let the film be evaluated on its own terms, and, on its own terms, The Lightning Thief has considerably more going for it than the 48% suggests. Rick Riordan's public record of frustration with the 2010 production is detailed, specific, and illuminating in ways that go beyond the usual author. dislikes adaptation complaint. The notes he submitted to the studio during production, which he eventually published on his website after years of declining to publicly relitigate the experience, reveal a systematic set of concerns about the adaptation's core decision: Percy's age increase, the removal of the Ares subplot, which in the novel is the mechanism through which Luke's involvement is foreshadowed and which gives Percy a meaningful divine antagonist at the human scale before he reaches Olympus. The change to Grover's character arc, which in the book involves his personal quest for the god Pan and gives him an independent narrative drive beyond protecting Percy. The handling of the prophecy and the oracle, which in the novel provides a structural spine that the film largely discards. What's striking about reading Riordan's notes is that most of his objections are structural rather than sentimental. He isn't complaining about favored scenes being cut for time. He's identifying places where the adaptation removed load-bearing elements and then seemed surprised when the structure felt less stable. The Ares subplot isn't just a fun additional conflict, it's the mechanism that complicates Percy's understanding of the divine world and forces him to realize that not every god is a potential ally just because they're not Hades. Without it, the film's moral universe is slightly simpler than the novels, and the climactic Luke revelation lands with less thematic context around it. None of this means the 2010 film is a failure of craft. It means it's a successful execution of a vision that diverged from the source in ways that cost it some of the source's structural intelligence. Those are different problems, and the difference matters when you're trying to understand what the movie is and what it isn't. The sequel, Percy Jackson, Sea of Monsters, arrived in 2013 with a reduced budget, a changed director, and an audience that had partially moved on. It grossed $68 million domestically, significantly less than The Lightning Thief, and the franchise was quietly retired before the third installment could enter development. The conversation about what Percy Jackson could have been, in the hands of the franchise machinery, essentially ended there, and then, a decade later, it was reopened from a completely different direction. The Disney Plus series, which premiered in December 2023, with Rick Riordan serving as a writer and producer, approached the source material with the patience and fidelity that the film had declined to attempt. Percy was 12 again. The Ares subplot was restored. The oracle, the prophecy, the structural scaffolding that the novel relied on, all of it was rebuilt with the care of an adaptation made by people who understood why it mattered. Riordan, who had spent years unable to publicly engage with the 2010 film without diplomatic evasion, was openly enthusiastic about the series in a way that was, by contrast, a complete and unmistakable verdict on the earlier production. The critical and fan reception to the Disney Plus series was largely positive, particularly from the book's long-term readership, who had been waiting 18 years for an adaptation that felt like the story they knew. What's interesting is what that reception reveals in retrospect. The audience for faithful Percy Jackson adaptation was always there, always substantial, and always patient enough to wait for it. The 2010 film didn't fail to find its audience. It found a different audience, one that responded to the particular thing it actually was, while the original readership waited, somewhat grimly, for something else. Both audiences were real. Both were right about what they wanted. The mistake was thinking there was only one. What does it mean for a film's legacy when the corrective version arrives and succeeds? In some cases, it means the original is forgotten, superseded, relegated to a historical curiosity, the thing people mentioned briefly before discussing the real version. That hasn't happened with The Lightning Thief, and there's a reason for it. The people who grew up with the 2010 film, who watched it at 9 or 10 or 11, who wore out their DVDs, who argued about it with friends, who carried Logan Lerman's Percy and Uma Thurman's Medusa and Brandon T. Jackson's Grover forward into the interior mythology of their adolescence. Those people don't experience the Disney Plus series as a replacement. They experience it as a parallel universe, a different telling of the same story, which is what adaptations of beloved material are anyway. The 2010 film is not worse because a better version exists. It is what it is, independently on its own terms, for the people it reached in the way it reached them. And it reached a specific generation at a specific moment with a specific message, that the things the world had labeled as your deficits might be your gifts in disguise, that the system measuring you might be using the wrong ruler, that the story of who you are is not finished just because the institution gave you a grade. That message didn't require perfect filmmaking to land. It required honest storytelling, and whatever the film's structural imperfections, whatever the script choices that frustrated Riordan, whatever the critical consensus that filed it away as an adequate but unremarkable franchise attempt, the message landed. For a significant number of children who needed exactly that specific thing at exactly that specific time, it landed with the force of something true. There's a question this film keeps asking without quite stating it directly, and it's the question worth sitting with long after the credits roll and the mythological geography of the story has faded from immediate memory. What do we do with the gods when they fail us? Not metaphorical gods, actual institutions, actual systems of authority, actual inherited structures of power that claim the right to shape our understanding of ourselves and then exercise that right carelessly or selfishly or not at all. What do we do when the things that were supposed to see us clearly looked right through us instead? Luke's answer was fire, destruction, start over from nothing, even if nothing is the cost. Percy's answer was something harder, less satisfying. Stay in the world, hold on to the connections that are real, refuse to let the institution's failures become the final word on what's possible inside it. Neither answer is complete. Neither is meant to be. The story doesn't resolve into a clean verdict because the question it's asking doesn't have one. What it has instead is a 16-year-old kid standing in a small apartment in New York with a minotaur horn on his desk and a mother in the kitchen. And a world outside the window that is simultaneously the ordinary world it always was, and a mythological landscape hiding in plain sight, full of ancient power and institutional failure and individual love and monsters around every corner. And somewhere, above it all, a floor that most people will never find. The elevator is still there. The button is still there. The question is whether knowing what's at the top makes the ride worth taking. Percy Jackson decided it did. So, it seems, did a great many of us. Probably both. The resilience of craft beneath commercial compromise, and the measure of what an industry accepts when the numbers still come in. But here's the thing about Clash of the Titans, that the commercial story and the 3D story and even the performance story can obscure, if you let them. This film has a theology, a genuine, internally consistent set of beliefs about the relationship between humans and divine authority. And those beliefs are strange and specific and considerably more interesting than anything you'd expect from a movie that opens in the spring blockbuster window between March and May. Let's pull it apart. The theological economy. The film establishes its cosmological rules in its very first minutes of voiceover. Gods were born from human belief. They require worship to sustain their power. Without it, they weaken. This makes the relationship between Olympus and Earth less a hierarchy of creator over creation than a transaction between supplier and customer. And a transaction, crucially, that both parties can exit. That's not how ancient Greek religion actually worked, and the departure is deliberate. In genuine Greek mythology, the gods don't require human worship in any transactional sense. They exist independently. They're indifferent, largely, to human piety. They're pleased by sacrifice and offended by insult, but their power isn't contingent on human belief the way the film's cosmology makes it. The film is taking a very specific theological model, the post-Enlightenment idea that gods are human constructions, that they exist because we need them to, rather than independently of us, and encoding it into the story's metaphysical ground rules. The implication is radical. If gods need human belief to survive, then the moment humans collectively decide the transaction isn't worth it, the moment the city of Argos tears down its Zeus statues and stops praying, the gods are in existential trouble. Worship is leverage. The worshippers hold structural power over the worshipped, whether they know it or not. The rebellion in Argos, which plays as defiance against an overwhelming force, is actually something more interesting than bravery. It's a population slowly discovering that it controls the power supply. This reframes Hades' entire scheme. He isn't trying to overthrow Zeus because he's evil. He's trying to establish an alternative power source, fear, that isn't dependent on the increasingly unreliable commodity of voluntary human worship. Fear doesn't require consent. Fear doesn't require the worshiper to believe in the worth of the object of worship. Fear scales regardless of whether the humans respect the entity producing it. It's a rational economic response to a supply chain problem, executed by a character who has been operating at a structural disadvantage for millennia and has found the only workaround available to him. This doesn't make Hades sympathetic exactly, but it makes him legible in a way that simple villainy doesn't. And it makes the conflict between the divine siblings less about good versus evil than about two competing models of authority, voluntary versus coerced, love versus fear, and whether either of them in the long run is sustainable. The Christian, God, in Greek clothing here is the mythological puzzle at the center of the film that almost nobody talked about in 2010, and that becomes more interesting the longer you look at it. The Hades of Clash of the Titans is not the Hades of Greek mythology. The Greek Hades is Zeus's brother, a co-equal ruler of a third of the universe, a stern and just administrator of the dead who rarely leaves his domain and has no interest in overthrowing Olympus. He isn't evil. He isn't even particularly malevolent. He's just the god of a domain that makes humans uncomfortable, which over centuries gave him a dark reputation by association rather than character. The Hades of this film is a fallen angel. Trace the character's design decisions. He feeds on fear rather than worship, operates in explicit opposition to the primary deity, works through manipulation and corruption from a position of permanent exile below the world of light, seeks to usurp the power of the ruling divine authority, and carries a specific personal grievance about having been given the worst assignment in the cosmic division. Replace the Greek names, and that is, structurally, the Satan of Christian tradition. Cast down, resentful, resourceful, making the best of a bad situation by becoming the worst thing possible. This substitution isn't accidental. It's the film's solution to a fundamental problem with marketing ancient Greek mythology to 2010 Western audiences. Those audiences already have a narrative structure for understanding divine conflict, and that structure is Christian, and it maps protagonist-friendly good versus evil logic far more cleanly than the actual Greek mythological framework, where the gods are amoral, capricious, and largely indifferent to human suffering as a moral category. The Kraken complicates this further. The Kraken isn't Greek. It's Norse, a Scandinavian sea creature with no meaningful presence in Greek mythology whatsoever. Its inclusion is the film's most obvious mythological anachronism and the most revealing one. The production needed a final boss that communicated ultimate scale and ultimate threat, and the Kraken's cultural footprint, amplified by everything from Victorian poetry to video games, gave it an immediate legibility that any accurately Greek sea monster would have lacked. And then the jinn. Islamic desert spirits introduced into a Mediterranean Bronze Age narrative with no explanation offered or apparently needed. 3 different mythological traditions, Greek, Norse, and Islamic, operating side by side as if they share a world, which in this film they simply do. What this mixing reveals is what contemporary Western audiences actually want from ancient mythology: Greek aesthetics and character names, Norse monster scale, and a Christian theological framework to organize the moral architecture. The film isn't confused about its mythology. It's deliberately constructing a mythology that feels ancient and familiar at the same time, ancient enough to have grandeur, familiar enough to have a legible good versus evil spine. Whether that's intellectually honest is a separate question from whether it's effective storytelling. As storytelling, it mostly works. As mythology, it's a fascinating hybrid that tells you more about 2010 than about ancient Greece. Mortality, as philosophical position, strip the action away, strip the gods away. What Clash of the Titans is arguing, at its philosophical core, is that mortality is not a deficiency to be overcome. This is a position with genuine ancient precedent. Epicurean philosophy argued that the finite nature of human life is precisely what gives it meaning, that the desire for immortality is a category error, a confusion of quantity with quality. Perseus, who has never read Epicurus and wouldn't care if he had, arrives at this position through loss and instinct rather than philosophy. His desire to remain mortal is rooted in love for the people who were mortal alongside him. But the film makes a larger argument beyond Perseus's personal grief. It argues that mortal limitation is actually a form of power. The gods in this world are trapped by their own permanence, by the endless continuation of existence without the urgency that endings create, by the dependency on human worship that their immortality has made structural. Zeus can't simply stop caring whether humans pray to him. His survival depends on it. Hades can't simply choose a different relationship with humanity. Fear is the only currency he has. The immortals are locked into their conditions by the very permanence that theoretically makes them superior. Perseus can do something neither of them can: choose. He can choose to fight for reasons that have nothing to do with power or survival. He can choose to stay mortal even when offered an exit. He can spend his life as if it matters because it will end, which is the exact condition the gods can never inhabit and can never fully understand. His mortality isn't a weakness in the conflict with divinity. It's the one asymmetric advantage he has. He has something to lose that they don't: defiance and legitimacy. The film poses a political question that it never quite asks directly. When is defiance of authority legitimate? Argos's rebellion is framed sympathetically, a population withdrawing consent from a power structure that isn't serving them. The tearing down of divine statues reads as progressive, as an assertion of secular self-determination against religious coercion. The film endorses this framing at the level of its protagonist, who refuses divine authority personally and physically throughout. But the film also shows the cost of that defiance with unusual honesty. Hades' response to Argos's rebellion is not disproportionate in the film's own internal logic. The city genuinely was withdrawing the thing the gods need to survive. Cassiopeia's boast wasn't merely impolite, It was an act of public desecration with real consequences in a world where gods are physically real and physically responsive. The film doesn't quite let the rebellion be unambiguously right. It shows people dying for choices they made with incomplete information about the stakes, and it takes that seriously rather than papering over it with heroic triumphalism. This ambivalence is what keeps Clash of the Titans from being simple. A truly simple version of this film would have the rebellion be completely vindicated, the gods be completely in the wrong, Perseus' victory be completely cost-free. Instead, the film maintains a moral complexity about the relationship between defiance and consequence that feels closer to how actual historical resistance works. Messy, costly, morally necessary even when not morally clean, than the clean narrative logic most blockbusters apply to their heroic conflicts. Perseus wins, Argos survives, and the world is left exactly as complicated as it was before the quest began, because the gods are still there, still real, still requiring worship or distributing punishment. The victory changes the immediate situation without resolving the underlying condition, which is, honestly, how most meaningful victories work.